Hey, welcome back to Rumblings and Remardan. We're now on Chapter 8, Money. Inept Deus left behind Matthias as they both parted ways from each other. The lieutenant went back into the fortification, and Inept Deus towards the outskirts of the village. The major activities were still getting going as the sun raised itself into a low hum in the sky. That molten ball had finally turned a brilliant orange, while Inept Deus noticed the passing few villagers walk by. They were all humans at this point in the morning. One or two nodded in a friendly way towards him, but the majority refused to even acknowledge the dwarf's presence in their area. He hurried on his way back home, passing the various institutions that marked the exit to the village. The relatively large general store stood on the edge of the town, selling all various and sundry items. Mostly inside there was an assortment of small cutting knives collected from the blacksmith, and some farming equipment for everyone's usage. The larger weapons were only specifically made for the Reitzers and the army who used them. Another, better dwarven smith was used inside of the castle walls for that. Armador's gnarled old body could be seen standing outside his smithy, smoking pipeweed from an equally gnarled old hickory pipe. Inept Deus finally remembered his new mentor and smiled warmly. He wouldn't be working there anymore. Inept Deus stopped by as the blacksmith gave a hiccuped surprise at the dwarf's presence. "You're here early. I wasn't expecting that you'd be so eager to get back to work," the old man said. Inept Deus took a long yawn before answering. "Gotta get used to working without me, Armador. I've enlisted with the army this morning. Just stopped by to give you the news and say goodbye, sir." The old man's crooked jaw fell open upon Inept Deus's pronouncement. He hadn't even the slightest idea that this turn of events might have happened. After one day's work only, this dwarf was quitting on him, and Inept Deus had shown a special talent for blacksmithing. Armador said while gesticulating fervently, "You can't do this to me, Inept Deus. You just started. Your parents and I have a deal." Inept Deus grinned widely back at the angry human who stood at least a head above him. Not being abashed in the slightest, Inept Deus said, "I'm not my parents, Armador. Take it up with them. But my word's already with the army. Now that I can't change. Maybe Alius will take it up with you in my stead." And with that, Inept Deus left the blacksmith sputtering in his red-faced anger, cursing the ground and all dwarves in general as lazy good-for-nothings who didn't deserve what the humans gave them. Continuing with that wide smile of his, Inept Deus walked on by, quickening his pace simultaneously. The old man's eyes still were burning a hole in his winter coat, and the ears of the dwarf started to turn red, but he kept on going. Doubt gripped his mind once again, as those two voices propped each other up in his head, competing for attention. "Well, that wasn't very nice of you to do. Should have told him the truth." One higher-pitched voice stated in supreme confidence. The other chimed in at this point. "Nice or not, wasn't it fun? That old man deserves worse than we gave him. What's the point if we're leaving this place anyway?" Inept Deus's thoughts ran about coldly. Then he thought that he really wanted not to return to the place. Too many people had been hurt by Inept Deus, and all of them women. They nagged at the back of his mind almost every day, but he couldn't help on looking at the next one as simply another conquest to be had. Inept Deus brushed these thoughts away with one fell swoop of his gaze upon the ever-receding houses. He almost forgot about breaking down the golden shekels that hung on his neck, until a golden-crowned hawk swooped down upon a tree, making his neck strain to view it. It was quite beautiful to behold. The brown feathers on its body led from the yellow talons right up to its strangely shaped crooked neck. Sitting on that neck lay a forward-viewing head with beady little green eyes that sat staring right back at Inept Deus. Inept Deus stopped in his tracks, simply watching the hawk in its contest with the dwarf. He was an especially stubborn dwarf, and Inept Deus refused to break eye contact first with the animal. After a hardly perceptible couple of minutes passed by, with this strange scene of man staring at bird, the bird finally decided it had lost, and it swooped after a low-flying sparrow. The dwarf had won this round. Inept Deus undoubtedly congratulated himself as he turned back to find the local elf who was in charge of breaking money. The moneylender hid himself inside of the castle itself, but it was still too early for him to have left his village house and start work. Inept Deus didn't care that the elf hadn't started his day. No one waited for Inept Deus to get his start. He was simply thrown to the wolves in the morning. The orange-bearded dwarf walked towards the squat, though large, lowly shingled house of the moneylender, Yakov. Everyone always talked about the elf. After all, he was the only one in the closest area around Estonia. The man made a good living off of his trade in the village. No humans were allowed, or had the means to start a lending firm, and all good followers of Gorgonus viewed it as a despicable and vile business. Anyone in their right mind tried to avoid the practice. Now, Inept Deus was no exception to that rule. His parents had instilled in him a strong dislike for debt. They always spent whatever was in their means, and often didn't have enough for that, even. Elves, as well, held an irreparable reputation in Remardan. The tall, fair-haired, often tanned people most likely originated in the south. The folk in the northern kingdoms viewed all elves with a certain suspicious skepticism. Inept Deus held these feelings and thoughts in his head at the start, but his parents both did a very good job of proving that a person's worth was based on what they were able to do. And so, although Inept Deus disliked the idea of doing business with an elf, he still went onwards to break down his shekels with Yakov. Inept Deus went up to the dark wood that defined the entrance to the moneylender's house. Nothing gave off any sign that Yakov was up. No noise or light could be seen shining through the windows of his house. Inept Deus knocked hard on that door, hoping to rouse the elf inside. He was a rich man now, and had no time to waste breaking the money and getting on the road tomorrow. Things had to be set in order for his journey. It was an important quest, after all. Inept Deus let out another long yawn, covering his bearded mouth loosely with his hand in a sign of politeness for the elf who had just sleepily opened the door. Yakov at first yawned in response to Inept Deus's, and then he resumed his natural scowl. The elf stood a good 3 head lengths above the dwarf. He was somewhere in his middle ages, and bright purple eyes stuck out of sunken eyelids. The man held wide lips with curved downwards to go along with his curly mustaches and curly hair overall. After they both suppressed their yawns, the elf said in the whiny, high-pitched voice that seemed typical of his race, "What do you want? I don't know you, and if you're here for business, I don't open till later in the day. Come to the castle, then." Inept Deus squinted long into the greedy elf's eyes before saying, "I've got several shekels to break. Really want to pass up all of this money because you're too tired?" Inept Deus's tone had completely changed from his usual friendly and casual voice. He was exhausted, and hadn't eaten in what felt like ages. Inept Deus had no time for incompetence, especially none coming from a dirty elf. At least the dwarf always kept it in his mind what not to do. the overall sense of what would get someone to call the right stars on him. Normally, for a dwarf like Inept Deus, that was a very slim threshold to cross. Yakov was never in any real position to argue with any of his clientele either, due to the large sums of money that were normally thrown around his way to break. The elf made some sort of unintelligible curse in his own language and reluctantly said, "Fine, come in. We'll get sorted things out quickly in my office." Inept Deus entered his manor house and stared all around, never having seen so much wealth in his life before. He wanted to explore every part of it. The home had a widely winding, free-floating staircase that went up towards the elf's second floor, which must have held even greater riches than this one. There were various gifts and articles of achievement posted all over the walls in his house. Yakov had set up a couple of elaborately carved chairs in the middle to surround a smallish table that went with them. Upon that table appeared an ornately decorated tea kettle and several, at least 2 teacups fit to match it in a brilliant blue and white pattern that gleamed against the light there. There was plenty of light to warm up the place also. The floors were a hard-packed dirt still, but beyond that, everything spoke of wealth. Yakov had decorated his place wonderfully, and a vast array of everything that bequeathed a cultured home. Several homespun rugs lay around on the floor, trying to distract from the dirt. It did a great job, too, at taking the mind out of this humble village and towards some place in the capital. Decorated on the walls were more dishes of varying colors made out of both clay and fire-worked glass. Orange especially stood out among his collections, a beautiful fiery orange, which almost matched Inept Deus's beard. It struck him that these things must have been worth at least as much as the village itself. He was reminded again about the secretly hidden wealth that all elves were known to possess. But if these were the things that simply decorated his walls and floors, then there had to be an immense amount of wealth, of shekels, hidden somewhere out of sight. Inept Deus didn't have time to ponder that, however. He was too busy pulling the pouch from around his neck that contained his own immense wealth. They had scarcely walked into the elf's house before Yakov interrupted Inept Deus's wonderings about the place. The tall man held a besmirched grimace on his face before saying to Inept Deus, Yes, I know. All very lovely. That's why these sites are normally reserved to invited guests." He practically spat out these last words at the dwarf. Inept Deus was flustered at the start, but he quickly regained himself, muttered a curse at the angry elf, and glowered at the floor. There wasn't much he could do in his position. He just needed to get that money broken down so he could finally get out of this place. Inept Deus was no more happy dealing with the elf as Yakov did with this dwarf. Both regarded each other with suspicion and a little bit of hatred from each of their sides. Though Yakov had dealt with exclusively dwarves, he still disliked them for their short nature, both in their temperament and height. Of course, no one could rightfully blame him, as no one else liked to deal with Ornorian and his dwarves anyways. But this dwarf had come to an angry and awoken Yakov. There was no pleasing the elf in this state. The two of them walked past this large room into something that resembled an office for the elf. There were books lying on the hickory desk, and more than plenty inside of the oaken bookshelves that lined the walls. A sturdy door sat in the middle of them, displacing the otherwise pleasing look of the room. There was an immense wrought iron handle that stood out on it, thanks to the ridiculous-looking locks that protruded on the frame right above that handle. Inept Deus could only guess as to what might be concealed inside of that room. Most likely that vast quantity of elf gold hidden back there for no one to get a hold of. On the desk sat several rolled-up manuscripts that had recently been tossed aside in a hurry, which showed several high-ranking numbers that Inept Deus was able to make out. There sat next to them a particularly ornate candelabra that closely resembled the ones he had glimpsed inside of Arnorian's castle. Yakov at least had the timidity to invite his guest to sit down across the desk from him, as he asked, "So, you wake me up early for what, Inept Deus?" The dwarf was taken aback by this. He had hoped that not many people knew about his existence in the village, but I suppose all those years of chasing after women really had caught up with the dwarf. He had built a little reputation for himself there. Inept Deus sat roughly into the offered chair, which was at least a half-foot lower than the desk itself, so all in all the dwarf decided to play his cards. He unintentionally forced Yakov to stoop over him from the other side of the desk like some insane crow who wanted all things precious in his nest. The dwarf stammered a bit as he responded to this person. "How do you know my name?" The elf had finally stumbled upon something that cheered his mood a bit. He laughed and said, "You're the only dwarven serf anyone knows. Of course I know you. I doubt there's anyone in Arnorian's court that doesn't know about you and your family. Even the kingdom probably knows about you. Now, you woke me up this early. Why?" Yakov raised his hands in anger to demand an answer out of this new client who had proven so annoying to him. There wasn't much beyond gold and a good night's sleep that Yakov enjoyed besides his wife once a week. She was sick this week, with some sort of fever that gripped her in its clutches. The elf was sparing nothing as he gave Inept Deus a quick tongue lashing for interrupting his sleep before finally settling down to business. The tall man glowered down and said, "All right, so you came into some money. Show me and let's get this thing going. I might be able to catch another hour of sleep before opening up the shop at least." He winked in a surprising show of good nature towards Inept Deus. The dwarf struggled with the weight of the gold around his neck as he withdrew the pouch full of the bounty from the night. The golden shekels weighed him down in a ridiculously strenuous fashion. For the time being, he was able to take out and display the currency on the table in front of the elf for the old man to inspect. Yakov was almost gobsmacked by the number of shekels that this notoriously poor serf withdrew from his pouch. He lifted one up, turned it around for a while before finally taking out some extremely wiry spectacles to look upon this sight. And upon further examination into the large rectangular shekels, Yakov slowly began to realize exactly what he was seeing here. The elf started in a worrying tone to Inept Deus. "What are you showing me here?" "These are real." "Who gave you all these shekels? Who'd you steal them from, huh? Will you tell me, or should I go straight to Arnorian about this?" Inept Deus had thought before that it did seem like a ridiculous amount of money, but he had so hoped on the greed of the elf that Yakov wouldn't question it and just make more money from him. Apparently, he had made the wrong assumption. Before Inept Deus had a chance to get flustered, he said, "I'm breaking this money for the army. They just got a shipment in. Have to do something about payroll, you know. You think I'd be able to steal all this money? I mean, who even has it here in Atrotna? Only the Gersog, the army. You know how Arnorian hates me." Yakov stared him down over the desk, testing this theory that Inept Deus had come up with. It was a rather good lie on Inept Deus's part, but there might still be too many questions asked. The elf played with a quill that sat upon his desk as he thought over this whole situation. "And what would convince me that you didn't steal this amount?" The elf was making a chagrined smile in the view of Inept Deus as he asked this. The dwarf tightened up, put his arms across his chest before replying. And how would I steal it? He didn't mean to sound angry, but nevertheless he almost shook the office with his thundering voice. How would I sneak past the guards and unlock the chest in full view of everyone? Huh? Elf? He threw the word out as if it were an accusation, thrusting a dagger into an open wound. Yakov had none of it, however. He stood to his full height, knocking back the heavy oaken chair he had occupied just moments ago. You dare defy me in my own home? You barge in here as a dirty, sick Yurden, expecting me not to question you? He spat out the name like it was a plague on his tongue. The two traded insults back and forth for a time before finally calming down. They stood in a sulky silence together, staring each other down. It wasn't the first time Inept Deus had been engaged in such an exchange. The people in the village knew him to be hot-headed and stubborn, a winning combination if ever there was one. Still, those people needed to use the dwarf for their own means, and he simultaneously needed them. After some hurt feelings which Inept Deus cared little about, they got on about their business. It wasn't always like that, however. He went about the village with a grin normally plastered on his face, even for those undeserving of it. It was only when the time was low and his patience was tested that he had these problems. The problem now was just with the elf. They calmed down a little bit before breathing and seething at each other. Inept Deus was the first to break the silence by sitting and saying, in an overly familiar tone, Damn it, Yakov, I just need some money broken down. Is that so hard? Fuck you, but you're right. This does appear to be a lot here, dwarf. I have to take another look. Yakov shouted at him, seething with anger still. Inept Deus jingled all of the money from his neck pouch onto the fair wooden desk in front of him with no concern of damaging it. The remaining golden shekels glimmered in the approaching daylight that now lit the room. The sun shined all over the beady eyes of the elf, who now understood that this dwarf wasn't lying at all. Yakov's thoughts were dispelled by the sudden realization that he wasn't being played for a fool. After inspecting that first one so long ago, his eyes now exploded in greed for his upcoming exchange. They both were sitting at this point. Yakov bent to pick up the chair from behind him. There was something beautiful in all of those thick golden shekels plastered with the imprint of the long-dead King Coelius. His imperious gaze stood out from the metal which he found himself entombed on. The king stared into Inept Deus's eye in a seductive way that attracted him to the gold, not wanting to part it anymore. He knew breaking it was a necessary step in being able to outfit himself for the journey, but he loathed the idea of giving all four up. Besides, what if he might need it in the future? Inept Deus was miserly in a way that those who do not regularly eat would understand. The dwarf quickly snatched a shekel back from the desktop, scratching it with slightly in his rush, and delved it back into the pouch around his neck. Yakov widened his eyes for a second as Inept Deus did this, but quickly understood. The elf began to count out the remaining ducats and groats to match the 3 remaining shekels. Yakov kept counting. All right, 10 ducats for every shekel, and 100 groats for every ducat. How do you want it, Inept Deus? All ducats, all groats, or half and half? Or however mixed you want. Of course, I'll be taking half a shekel as my fee. Inept Deus was taken aback by this sly elf who wanted so much for a simple money exchange. Now you can't be serious. Half a shekel? That's ridiculous. A ducat is more like what you should be getting. Yakov placed a very calm look down his nose at Inept Deus. The young man had no real idea who he was dealing with. Just some other potato counter, he was sure. But the elf gave off something sinister in the way he held his love for money and all things material. The dwarf deigned to reply to this greedy potato man. "A ducat is what it's worth to me. That's all you'll get. Hell, you make money for doing nothing. Just be happy to make the exchange, elf." Yakov wasn't having any of it, however. He knew his own worth, as well as the worth of almost everyone in the village, and he damn well knew the Securians hardly had 200 groats to their name as is. The elf drew out his voice and smiled as he said, "Now, Inept Deus, we both know I'm doing you a favor here. There's others who expect to get a share of whatever I make from these sort of things. You know, the big man in charge. You know how he deals with the taxes, Ornorian. There's no reason why he doesn't deal with me as harshly as you all. I'll do 4 ducats and 50 groats for my cut, and you'll thank me for it." Inept Deus wasn't having it. He still believed the man had no right to take any of this money, any other place, and he wouldn't. "I'll let you have 2 ducats then, and you will thank me for it. Let's make it 3 ducats and 50 groats. Everyone wins. You get your money, and I don't tell anyone that you had so much to begin with." Inept Deus considered for a moment before finally settling on an acceptable number in his head. 3 ducats and that's it. No more for you. That's already more than most people make in a year. Yakov practically slobbered at the opportunity to make a killing off of this bumpkin who idiotically came to him. 3 ducats sounds like a rip-off, but I'll do it, Inept Deus. I'll settle on that, but I'm not happy about it. They shook hands, finally agreeing on a deal. Inept Deus felt happy and confident, thinking that he had taken advantage of this gross elf, while Yakov kept his calmly guarded face, which turned sour at agreeing on the prospect of giving anything up, but with the knowledge that he had just taken this sucker. Inept Deus drew himself up in the chair, as he stated clearly before the senior magistrate, "Give it to me in 300 groats, and the rest in ducats. Hell, I'll even let you have 30 groats as an extra so I don't feel as bad." Yakov's expression turned into one of glee at the prospect of making even more off of this old sod. "Fair's fair, Inept Deus. You got me there. All right." The elf counted out Inept Deus's money for him after lugging out a big, ironclad lockbox from behind his table. The key that was used on it reminded Inept Deus of how paranoid he was of people getting to his own wealth. He shared a momentary thought that Yakov wasn't too dissimilar to himself. But then the dwarf brushed aside that thought, scooped up the money into the pouch reserved for his more modest dealings, and deposited the groats into the one on his belt, while the ducats went back to join the shekel on his neck. Inept Deus started to realize just how heavy it all was. He thought of a hiding place back home where he could place the majority of his money at. Of course, his family could use it. But really, did they need it so much? Inept Deus thought to himself in waves that the family would just squander it on something meaningless. They had always found a way to get by, and, they would now. This money was his, after all. He had been the recipient of it, no one else. Gorgonus thought that he had been worthy enough to be chosen for this mission from the sublime second. His parents, his brother, no one else was the person who was capable of doing this for his majesty. Inept Deus stood up once more, this time completely calm, across from Yakov and said with a smile, "Thank you. Hopefully we won't have this unpleasantness between us again, Yakov. The elf bowed in front of him. I agree. After all, it was a pleasure doing business with you, even though it is so damn early. They both released a powerful yawn simultaneously, and the elf led Inept Deus out of the room and back into the antechamber of his luxurious house. Yakov smiled in his wan manner towards the young man. Good luck getting that money back to the army. Thank you, and thank you for changing it. Gorgonis guide your day, Yakov. Inept Deus left and continued onwards towards his final destination of home, past the village houses and all those inhabitants lying inside on that early morning. There were few serfs showing up already in the market square to hawk their measly goods, a few to simply watch whatever intimidating tricks the army would show off to get new recruits. There was one carriage that stood out among the rest. It was a large wagon with green and brown painted over it. The carriage had beautiful flowers painted all over the sides of this ornately dilapidated carriage. A tired smile crept across his face. Inept Deus recognized this rather strange-looking wagon. A family then tumbled out of it, a family that was the darkest-skinned humans he had ever seen, and it belonged to his friend. It was his old buddy, Samias, that wandering family of his. Inept Deus walked quickly to make himself known amongst them. Samias was the first to jump out and embrace this dwarf. Then Inept Deus broke off and smiled widely as he said, Oi, I haven't seen you in forever. What brings you back this far north, Samias? Where have you been, man? He was relatively tall for a human. Samias wore an elaborate shade of orange and brown upon his button-down tunic and traveler's coat. He wore a large cloak that fell over his puffy hair that squished it down. His hooked nose brought forth an awkward-looking hawk's face into perspective for Inept Deus. Samias had a rather nasally voice to go with his somewhat larger face. We've been everywhere, Inept Deus. It's fantastic to see you. We've been back down to the south, off towards Chleb, way down south. They don't have much to give down that way. Much nicer to be back up here. Everyone seems somewhat friendlier in the north. Plus, I don't have to worry about the sun so much. And the women, they're much better looking. They both laughed in hearty agreement to this statement of fact, while his family disappeared somewhere into the village. Then Inept Deus said, You have to tell me all the stories from your travels. I don't know where to begin. Samias drew out his words as well whenever he spoke. Well, when we first left here, we went straight to the capital. It took a couple of days, almost a week, but the performance was good at every stop. No one could believe how long I can run for. Ha! You should have seen how much they bet against me for their own boys. It was a bloodbath. And you know, the rest are good at what they do. Parents started juggling while serving drinks to the crowd of people watching the race. And of course, you know, the sister catches her own crowd. He backed into something of a dejected look. The capital is in chaos, however. These days, there's trouble in the farthest northern reaches. Something's going on there. He brushed it aside with a wave of his hand. Well, it's not much better anywhere. Visited Estonia. The orcs even led us through the wildlands onwards towards Chleb. Samias mused on going through those places. Now those people know how to throw parties, and don't think we made so much money anywhere else. Chleb was probably the worst of the kingdoms we went through this time. They hardly even let us in. Must not like performers very much there anymore. The cities aren't much to look at either. You're not missing anything if you never go there. Plus, we only saw the extended family for a day or two before they forced us to leave. Thought we were some sort of spies or something. I think we were lucky to get out of there with our lives. It's really nice being back in Remardan. I'll tell you that for sure. It's by far the best place to be. He looked around nervously to see if anyone was watching. I think we're going to be here in Estonia for a while. The tall, black man looked glum for a bit, but then turned his attention back onto Inept Deus. Well, so how have you been? It has been a bit to get back here, but at least we're here now. Inept Deus was relieved that the conversation had once again turned on to him to speak. Sometimes that nasally voice grated on him. Inept Deus considered for a moment to tell his friend the truth or not. Things have been better, Samias. Haven't slept since yesterday morning. Some sort of creature almost killed me. Inept Deus shrugged as if it were simply another day. The army's in town now, making things safe. But I'll be gone shortly. Going to take a trip to the capital. My parents thought it was time I explored and brought back some money from that place. Samias readily lit up to the prospect that his friend was getting out of here. Out of Estonia. Well, what do you say? Should I join? I know you can always use a hand these days, especially on the road. Inept Deus was thinking over his mission to the second Sublime Prince. He decided he could, in fact, use another person. Hell, Matthias is already joining me, so it sounds like a deal. Bring your own food and gold and anything else you need. We'll leave shortly after a good night's rest. He breathed out slowly, exacerbated at this whole situation. And Gorgonus grant us that. The two shook hands once again, and Inept Deus was by himself as he went further into the square. Suddenly, a wave of smells hit Inept Deus. Aromas from the far north. The smells of crepes being fried and stuffed with meat and jam. Kebabs being carved up left and right for use mixed into various vegetables and wrapped into potato rolls. There were market stalls everywhere he looked, with vendors buying and selling, shouting their prices, customers looking for the best deal on items. Though most people were fine at whatever prices the hawkers gave, the elves were a quite different group altogether. It seemed a caravan of that folk had arrived in Estonia. No matter where they came from, and what kingdom they came from, all elves seemed to have a knack for using their elongated noses to find the best deals in the market. Upon finding those deals, they quickly settled down to start haggling in order to get an even better price for whatever the product was, and save as much money as they could. The crowd was so thick that Inept Deus had to squeeze through people even before he entered the maze of tents. There was an almost overwhelming buzz of noise which came to his ears. He heard the people shouting over each other to try and find buyers for their goods, and people who were trying to sell their own goods to the vendors. He toured the various stalls as he made his way through them, trying to break out into the freedom of less crowded streets. On all sides he was surrounded by all sorts of different people. Humans, dwarves, elves, halflings, and even some lizardmen. In all the excitement from the night, Inept Deus had forgotten that today was market day. Estonia boasted of selling the finest coal in all of Remardan, so people showed up in droves to get a taste of the hard black stuff. The lizardmen were a race of individuals who held themselves in a very high degree to everyone else. This was partly due to their proclivity in creating new and ingenious inventions, which were mostly funded by their nobility in Estonia. The new devices were often readily embraced by the higher-ups there, and looked on with skepticism across all of the other kingdoms, which suited the citizens of Estonia just fine, since it kept their wares secret for a long while. The lizardmen as a whole were looked down on in distrust with conspiring with the enemies of Remardan. One could, perhaps, not blame the authorities and the denizens for their bias against the lizardmen, since to their average viewer, the races were so completely different. A race that represented and resembled closely snakes was no one's friend. There was one ridiculously tall human who was running a stall. It was his old friend, Brentus. He was 6'8", and let everyone know it too. He was an industrious young serf, always trying to get groats from people. He had brown eyes and very short hair to go along with his large ears. They hadn't seen each other in what felt like ages. There was a warm place in Inept Deus's heart for that strange human. They didn't talk much in daily life, but he was always staunchly present for playing poker whenever they got together. Until recent days, that is. Now, Inept Deus didn't stop this time. Instead, he continued onwards and brushed aside several dwarfs with brusque movements of his shoulders as they responded with gruff grunts and swift turns of their bodies to get out of his way. He almost tripped over a halfling who was arguing with the merchant over the cost of a couple packets of basil. Those damned halflings always managed to get in the way, whether it was fighting or farming or love. That tiny race always seemed to be competing with his people. Inept Deus tended to abhor them, for wherever the hobbits went, suffering seemed to follow. Their trade deals always seemed to benefit them too much. It was concerning, as if the halflings had some sort of magical power over the people they did business with. The halflings were put up with in the government of Remardan only because they made for good workers at facts and figures. But besides their use and utility, many among the lower castes did not like them at all. So at least Inept Deus was not alone in this fact. Even at this very moment, Inept Deus fell full on his face over the halfling children who played nearby. They were running under the market stalls and through the various people's legs. This happened also partly due to the nature of the man, that he was distracted by the gaudy displays of a voluptuous dwarf woman, who was not selling any product except for those of discreet mouth and worth. The halfling's children's father came out of nowhere and spat on what seemed like a careless dwarf, and threw curses in his direction. Inept Deus jumped up, declaring the evilness of the hobbit race. He started to give the children and the father succinct kicks in their shins, and he smiled upon hearing the satisfying crunch of halfling suffering. And that ends chapter 8, Money, of my book, my first book, Rumblings and Remardan. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want, pick up a copy. Sometimes the Kindle version is free. Otherwise, it's pretty cheap, and you'd help out a great deal. Well, thank you for listening. Have a good one.